Toussaint, the land of love and wine.
Exactly how I remembered it.
Blood and Wine is the second expansion for The Witcher 3, and was originally intended to be the last bit of content that developer CD Projekt Red would ever create in the Witcher series. Their stance on that seems to have shifted in the last few years, but they remain adamant that Blood and Wine was meant to serve as a final conclusion for Geralt's story, sending him on one last adventure in what is essentially a paid vacation in a beautiful, exotic new land with some form of his own happily ever after, before he puts up his swords and retires from his life as a monster hunter for hire. It's basically a farewell letter to Geralt and fans of the series. For that reason alone, Blood and Wine is a special, magical experience that serves as a fine conclusion to one of the most popular and successful games ever created, but there's a lot more to appreciate about Blood and Wine than its sentimental value.
Come to our aid, Witcher. Thus humbly beseeches you the Star-Crossed City's most gracious protectress, Her Illustrious Highness, Duchess Anna Henrietta.
Shall you answer her call?
The basic premise is that Geralt receives a summons letter from the Duchess of Toussaint, Anna Henrietta, with whom he had some previous interaction in the books, to help put a stop to a series of grisly murders that seem to be perpetrated by an unknown and mysterious monster, colloquially dubbed as the Beast of Toussaint by the locals.
The gods have sent the beast as punishment for our sins!
Thus you set out to an all-new region, Toussaint, whose culture is based largely on winemaking, art, and chivalric knighthood, to investigate the murders. Soon after, you discover that the Beast of Toussaint is no common monster, and that the situation is much more complicated than simply tracking and killing it, as the story goes into exploring the beast's motivations and trying to find an alternative solution to stop the murders without killing the beast. All the while, you're given free roam of a gorgeous new map with lots of optional side content to take part in at your own leisure. Whereas Hearts of Stone felt like it was basically just a new story, albeit an extremely good one with great characters and unique gameplay scenarios set within the confines of The Witcher 3, Blood and Wine is a full-fledged expansion fully deserving of its $20 price tag. With 30 or 40 hours of extra content alongside an all-new main story in a brand new region, complete with dozens of new quests, tons of new weapons and armor, new enemies, a new Gwent deck, a new system for improving Geralt's Witcher abilities with skill points and mutagens, new ways to customize the color of your armor sets, and a player home that you can upgrade to give you extra benefits as a base of operations, there's enough original content in Blood and Wine that it could have been sold as its own standalone game. The new mechanics are certainly a welcome addition. It's nice, for instance, that they finally implemented a new way to continue improving your character through level ups, since that's something that The Witcher 3 had been in dire need of going all the way back to the base game, and which wasn't addressed at all with Hearts of Stone. In my review of the base game, I criticized the progression for feeling slow and unrewarding, because it literally slowed down so much in the second half of the game by making you go longer periods of time between unlocking new skill slots, with significantly fewer slots to unlock in the second half of the game, that it felt like progression came to a screeching halt long before the game officially ended. Most of the skills you could unlock were just passive statistical modifiers too, so they didn't do much to enhance the gameplay in dynamic or exciting ways either. With Blood and Wine, there's a new, fully developed side quest given to you by a letter from whomever you romanced in the base game to look into an obscure researcher's work into Witcher mutations, which he was undergoing to try to reverse the effects that the Witcher's mutagens had on his son after he was taken to become a Witcher, but which ultimately had the opposite effect by imbuing the subject with all new mutations. By recreating Professor Moreau's experiment, you unlock the new mutation system, which allows you to spend a combination of skill points and greater mutagens on all new abilities. The mutation abilities are based around the three primary skill trees for combat, science, and alchemy, with branching paths that require hybrid combinations from adjacent branches, plus greater skill point and mutagen costs to learn more advanced abilities. These new abilities can have some pretty interesting gameplay-altering effects, like making the Ard spell have a chance to freeze enemies with an extra possibility of instantly shattering them in a one-hit kill if the enemy is simultaneously frozen and knocked down with the same cast, or making the crossbow potentially useful by multiplying its damage by 10, making it stun and knock down enemies, and making it deal 15% damage to the target's health on the first shot. Those abilities are a pretty big deal on their own, but they're made even more rewarding by simultaneously unlocking extra, regular skill slots to use more abilities from the base game skill system. After 150 hours of playing The Witcher 3, the last 75 of which felt pretty stagnant and boring in terms of character progression, it was nice to finally have this extra avenue to feel like I was actually getting stronger, and to finally give me some way to use all these extra skill points and mutagens that had been sitting around collecting metaphorical dust for so many dozens of hours throughout the end of the Wild Hunt and all of Hearts of Stone. Unfortunately, I found that the whole mutation system ran out of steam pretty quickly, and wasn't really as exciting as I thought it would be. The quest to unlock it is decently engaging, and the benefits are absolutely worthwhile, but you can only have one of these mutations active at a time, and some of them just seem to be straight up better than the rest. By just glancing over the skills, I could already tell that many of them would be completely pointless to me. Even though Cat's Eye finally boosts the crossbow enough to possibly be useful, I just didn't care for the crossbow in general and had no desire to implement it more actively into my playstyle. Second Life was of zero benefit to me whatsoever because its only purpose is to revive you when you die, which rarely ever happened for me anyway, and isn't much better than just reloading your save file. Toxic Blood reflects a portion of enemies' damage back at them, but only when you take damage, which is something you always want to avoid whenever possible, especially on higher difficulties where you can die in just a few hits. Mutated Skin reduces damage dealt to you by up to 45%, but it's dependent on adrenaline, so the actual reduction can vary throughout the fight, and you don't really need damage reduction if you're good at dodging or spamming Quen shields. Metamorphosis triggers random mutagen decoctions at no toxicity costs, but I don't like relying on random effects beyond my control, and they only last for 2 minutes at a time. Everything else was highly situational, gimmicky ways to improve damage, like Deadly Counter, which increases sword damage by 25%, but only against enemies immune to counterattacks, or Adrenaline Rush that increases damage by 30% at the start of combat for each enemy in the fight, but only for 30 seconds and then drops, or Bloodbath that increases damage by 5% for each successful strike, up to a max of 250%, but resets to 0 anytime you take damage. But why bother with any of these when the Euphoria skill combined with a high maximum toxicity can give you a constant baseline 210% damage boost without all of the gimmicky conditions or time limits? Even if you're trying to do a pure melee combat build, an alchemy build with the Euphoria mutation, combined with the incredible bonuses that come from having 4 decoctions active at a time, is mathematically superior to any of the red combat mutations or stacking red combat skills. The fact that it also boosts sign intensity by the same amount makes magic signs highly functional even with 0 points invested into the blue skill tree, thus making it doubly useful. With Euphoria being a tier 2 mutation, it's relatively quick and easy to unlock, and once you get that one skill, you're basically completely done with the mutation system, because basically nothing else is worth using unless you're playing with a heavy sign build, in which case you might want to take Piercing Cold to add extra functionality to the Ard spell instead, but that too is a tier 2 mutation. So in effect, you unlock the new mutations, spend a few hours building towards one of those tier 2 mutations, and then the progression system once again comes to a complete halt with nowhere left to build towards. You can keep learning extra mutations, but keep your desired one active in order to unlock more regular skill slots, but after unlocking the first 2, you reach a point where it takes 16 skill points to unlock the third slot, meaning potentially 16 level ups before you can start equipping more regular skills, which still require more skill points to actually learn. In my experience, I unlocked Euphoria and the first 2 skill slots relatively early, and then spent the remaining 75% of the expansion stockpiling skill points to no effect, since by the time I had accumulated 16 skill points, I was at the very end of the game and had no more reason to invest points anymore. So the mutation system can be fun and interesting, and we absolutely needed something to give us more ways to continue leveling up and getting stronger, since there already weren't enough options in the base game and Hearts of Stone did nothing to alleviate this problem, but I wish they could have done something more progressive that would have lasted throughout the entire expansion, with opportunity to feel yourself getting progressively stronger as you invest more and more points into the mutation system, as opposed to being a relatively simple one and done kind of upgrade.
Behold, sir, your estate in all its splendor.
The player home, Corvo Bianco, suffers a similar fate where it seems like a cool new gameplay mechanic with you having the opportunity to upgrade the estate with new features and functionality that will improve your statistical prowess while serving as a more consistent base of operations, but it, too, resolves itself extremely early in the expansion. After unlocking it, you get 2 waves of upgrades that you can pay for, and then wait a few days of in-game time for the upgrades to get installed, but this whole process takes literal minutes to accomplish, as it's simply picking options from the dialogue window and then meditating to pass the time. I literally spent more time getting the introductory tour of the estate than I did upgrading it. After that second wave, having spent a mere 15,000 crowns or however much it was, I was left with a somewhat empty and disappointed feeling of, that's it? It's all done now? As with the Mutations, it felt like the sort of thing that should have been developed over the course of the entire DLC, as opposed to maxing out all at once right at the beginning, with more stages towards completing the upgrades and more player involvement in doing so. What if, instead of just handing the Major Domo 5,000 crowns to perform general house renovations and then having everything happen off-screen, you had to talk to the master craftsman in town, pick someone to hire for the work, make decisions with them about the style or color schemes to implement, perhaps seek out some kind of rare, magical monster part to give the renovations an extra special characteristic or something like that? What if, instead of handing the Major Domo 1,000 crowns to order a new bed for you and having it delivered off-screen, something went wrong with the delivery and you had to investigate what happened, which could lead to any kind of crazy, inventive scenario like trolls ambushing the caravan and moving the bed into their cave as they fight over who gets to sleep in the new bed each night, with role-playing options to let them keep it and buy another bed, or talk them into giving you the bed back, or killing them and taking it from them. Instead of anything fun and interesting like that, you simply pick a few dialogue options and then everything happens instantly, with no real build-up or progression from inheriting the estate in its run-down condition to reaching its maximum productivity. There's still some degree of progressive customization involved, with decorating the manor by hanging different paintings in different spots, or setting up armor and weapon displays to showcase pieces you're not actively using but couldn't bring yourself to sell for whatever reason, but that's all superficial and inconsequential. The statistical upgrades, like the extra vitality boost from sleeping in your own bed, or getting an experience boost for having a library stocked with books, are useful of course, and it's nice to have a bunch of different services like grindstones and a storage chest in one convenient location, but it felt like a missed opportunity to do something more fun and mechanically involved with upgrading it.
Breathtaking! The perfect background for our masterpiece.
The first thing most people will probably fall in love with is Toussaint itself, with its bright, colorful fairy tale vistas offering a stark contrast to the oftentimes dark, decrepit, and brooding atmosphere of both the base game and Hearts of Stone. Everything in Toussaint is dripping with color, like someone at the studio took the saturation dial and cranked it all the way to 11, with a deep blue sky, airy white clouds, golden sun rays, lush green vegetation, and vibrant red, purple, and yellow flowers, all making the world spring to life in a far more rich and abundant sort of way than we've ever seen before in this series. It's not just the natural elements of this world either. The man-made structures of Beauclair, the capital city of Toussaint nestled at the base of the ducal palace, also have their buildings painted in all different sorts of contrasting colors, with little bits of artwork adorning their facades, and, in some cases, entire murals painted onto the walls. There's an artistic touch to almost every aspect of this world's visual design, even down to the architecture of the buildings themselves and the embellished look of the knights' armor sets, including the armor their horses wear. It's perhaps no surprise, therefore, that with the amount of artistry that went into this expansion's visuals, there are more than a couple of quests that deal directly with visual art, and other such artists plying their trade. The wonderfully rich atmosphere is further enhanced by the magnificent soundtrack, which is another masterful work of art from the composers at CD Projekt. The environmental music for most areas in the game have an utterly majestic, grandiose sort of tone to them that helps to paint the picture of Toussaint as this elegant and refined culture with a lot of natural and man-made beauty. Even the combat music has a more pleasant and laid-back sound to it, with the percussion and string rhythms often giving way to let the main melodies take center stage, which are themselves a little softer, smoother, and more sustained than the usual harsh pounding and accented sounds of typical combat music. Some tracks have a straight up magical, almost fantastical sound like that of a fairy tale wonderland. And the track for Lady Vivian might be one of my new favorites from all of The Witcher 3. The audio-visual aesthetics are simply exquisite, and the sheer beauty of everything makes exploring this new map refreshingly interesting, if only because it's also radically different from the environments and atmospheres that were present in the base game. And that's coming from someone who actually really likes the atmosphere in Velen, and who has a greater preference for the darker atmospheres of the first game. In truth, I'm not a huge fan of the bright, cheery look and quaint, picturesque atmosphere that Toussaint has going on, at least not in concept, because it doesn't necessarily feel right for a Witcher game, which to me are always at their best when they're exploring the more monstrous side of humanity and how our darker traits can manifest themselves in the form of literal monsters. The reason I find the Witcher games so unique and special in the first place is because of their strong fantasy folklore elements, which usually stem from weird, otherworldly, and oftentimes magical influences, typically as a result of people's inherent sinfulness or some generally evil presence. Basically all of my favorite quests, environments, story concepts, and atmospheres from the base game deal with this type of storytelling and imagery. Like the whole concept of Velen worshipping the crones and conducting barbaric bodily mutilation on themselves as ways to appease their goddesses while seeking their blessing, who turn out to be grotesque monsters that literally eat their loyal subjects. Or how the Bloody Baron's alcoholism and abusive behavior towards his wife led to her secretly aborting their unborn daughter, who turned into a botchling that preys on the blood of other pregnant women in their sleep. Or how Lady Annabelle died being eaten alive by plague-infested rats after the local villagers attacked the Lord of Velen's tower, and then turned into a plague maiden who seeks to spread pestilence over the rest of the world for the injustice done to her in death. That kind of stuff, to me, is the epitome of what the Witcher games are supposed to be about, or at the very least what I find most fascinating about them. Blood and Wine only has a little bit of that going on, kind of. For example, there's one quest where you have the option to lift a curse on a young maiden who has turned into a spotted wight, which is actually one of my favorite quests in the game, not just because of its darker themes and atmosphere, but because it has some genuinely tense moments with branching outcomes for your decisions, not to mention a neat reference to Gaunther O'Dim and Hearts of Stone.
The beggar then broke his spoon, cast a curse. She was beautiful, so he said she'd never wish to look at herself in the mirror again. Since she adored feasts, he swore no one would ever wish to sit and dine with her. And as she even refused him the crumbs from her table, he swore she'd never find a spoon in the world that would sate her hunger.
A harsh punishment.
But apart from a few exceptions like that, Toussaint is portrayed as an idyllic and virtuous paradise where the citizenry are generally good folk looking out for the well-being of others, with a highly enlightened culture allowing them to casually celebrate and partake in artistry of all forms, especially that of winemaking, and whose greatest burdens in life tend to be the physical toll of working the vineyards and the fact that monsters occasionally interrupt their viticultural pastimes by getting into their cellars or disrupting their grape harvests. Even then, the monsters are more like pesky vermin than dark, sinister monstrosities, as their role in the gameplay and story is primarily just to give you things to fight on the combat system, like generic mob enemies in any other sort of fantasy RPG, as opposed to being woven into the genetic blueprint of this region's folklore aesthetic.
Put up a good fight against the giant. Got experience battling monsters?
None. In Toussaint, we mostly chase bandits.
In the first game, for instance, archospores and their weaker subspecies Echinopsae were said to be created as curses at the site of especially cruel crimes for whom the victims' unjust fates were never atoned, and the first several instances when they appear are at the sites of murder victims as part of various different quests.
Archospore saplings? Takes a degenerate to cultivate something like this.
In Blood and Wine, their presence is explained as a weird exotic plant seed being grown in a hatchery to sabotage rival vineyards, and they get pasted indiscriminately all across the map for no discernible reason other than a vine-like plant seems like an appropriate thing to put in a vineyard, so let's do that. To be fair, that's kind of what they did with the archospores in the swamp in the first game, but at least the swamp feels like a monster-infested hellhole where murderers might be inclined to dump dead bodies, as opposed to a happy wonderland that just happens to have plant monsters in seemingly random places. The picturesque landscapes and relatively peaceful, luxurious lifestyle of Toussaint is why I consider this to be more of a paid vacation, since I think the whole point is for Geralt to get away from the usual grit and grime that his adventures typically involve. This is, after all, a place he would supposedly want to retire, and I don't think anyone would want to settle down in some place like Velen, for instance. And even though I have a greater personal appreciation for the darker and perhaps uglier environments the series is known for, a change of scenery can do wonders to breathe new life into the game so that it doesn't feel like you're doing the same thing all the time. Toussaint's scenic vistas, bright and saturated visuals, and more refined culture certainly have that invigorating and refreshing effect, like seeing a ray of sunshine after a week of nothing but dreary rain clouds, and there's no denying the overall quality of its design. I especially like how the world design uses a lot of rolling hills to let you see some of its more important locations from greater distances away. From just about anywhere in the map, you can pan the camera across the horizon and see several interesting looking places atop of various hills, literally sticking out from the rest of the world, thus calling your attention towards them and beckoning you to come explore them. There's something immensely satisfying about being able to see such notable landmarks from all the way across the map, and then being able to make a long trek all the way there and actually see them up close, which I think is a big part of the reason open world games can be so appealing in the first place. And Blood and Wine handles that aspect of the world design in a much more visually engaging and mechanically stimulating sort of way as compared to the base game, which was generally much more flat with trees or small mountains preventing you from seeing anything beyond your immediate surroundings, where you were typically forced to look at the mini-map or world map to figure out where the interesting places might be and thus where you should set off exploring. It helps, too, that the world map is a lot smaller than the base games, since that makes exploring this world feel like a much more manageable feat. I'd guess that it's roughly the same size as Velen from the base game, or maybe Skellige if you merged all the different islands into one larger island, which I feel offers a good balance between being a large enough space to facilitate open-ended, non-linear exploration while being small enough to not feel too overwhelming. Between the smaller scale and the notable landmarks being more visibly highlighted by the level design, it's the type of map that I think could be pretty satisfying to explore with the mini-map and unmarked points of interest turned off. There's also some interesting dynamic events going on with the world design, with your actions in some areas affecting nearby but as of yet undiscovered points of interest, which is something that the base game could have used a lot more of. In my review of the base game, I praised the world for showing signs of dynamic elements, but this was almost always accomplished through superficial means, like NPCs making different sorts of idle chatter after certain events, or showing a one-time scripted cutscene after request, rather than through mechanical gameplay changes. Blood and Wine introduces a new open-world mechanism around the bandit fortresses, called Hans bases, which are like main bandit headquarters that you have to invade and stop a messenger from lighting a signal fire to summon reinforcements, or else fight off even more bandits. The bases themselves aren't really that fun or exciting to me, as it's basically just a massive horde of copy-pasted bandit enemies, but the cool thing is that clearing out the base changes the events in nearby points of interest, such as by reducing the number of bandits that will appear in other locations or having them already wiped out by knights or wild animals by the time you get there. It's a nice new addition, since it does feel like these changes are causing a greater mechanical effect on the world. It's not just a pointless cosmetic change, and it makes the order in which you explore places now actually matter somewhat. Still, it only affects relatively minor and arguably superfluous aspects of the open world design, as opposed to something more dramatic like altering quest options or NPC relationships, so it's not quite as sophisticated or as involved as I would like it to be, but it's a welcome step in the right direction. Unfortunately, the world design inherits a few of the base game's problems, namely to do with pacing and the distribution of content, which were mitigated in Hearts of Stone by virtue of that DLC focusing more on its main quest and taking place in such a relatively small environment. With Blood and Wine, it seems like CD Projekt fell back into the trap of thinking bigger is better and that quantity is more important than quality, seeing as the vast majority of its open world content consists of what can only be described as tedious, shallow, and repetitive filler. In this relatively sizable new map, there's a variety of things to do spread out all over the place, but almost every single interactive point of interest that gets marked on the map is just an excuse for a small combat encounter with barely any kind of interesting story or characterization and no unique gameplay scenarios whatsoever. Of the various points of interest, 5 are for vineyard infestations where you kill a small group of monsters in an area and then a few nameless workers walk in and say thank you. 11 are bandit camps and Hans bases where you kill a few bandits and then loot a treasure chest and/or read a note. 15 are monster nests and monster dens where you kill a few monsters and loot a treasure chest. 11 are abandoned sites where you kill a group of monsters and then nameless NPCs show up to mourn their dead and get back to work. 8 are people in distress where you kill some enemies and then the NPC says thank you. 14 are guarded treasures where you kill an enemy to then loot a treasure chest and maybe read a note. And 14 are hidden treasures where you kill an enemy, read a note, follow a trail or quest marker, and open a treasure chest. That's 78 different things to do where all you do is fight generic enemies in generic environments for a pointless reward or utterly forgettable story conveyed exclusively through notes found on dead bodies. To be fair, those notes do attempt to tell some kind of story to better contextualize the world around you and why you're doing all these things, and I think CD Projekt does a better job with the narrative contextualization of these random points of interest than they did with the base game, but the problem is that there's just so much of it going on in this DLC, with too much reliance on cheap notes found on corpses to convey these stories that it gets old and tedious really fast. I can only read so many random notes on random corpses in random places about random things before it all starts to blur together in my mind and I start losing interest and stop reading them altogether. And really, I just find it extremely unrealistic that seemingly everyone in this world carries a journal on them at all times and keeps it updated until the moment before they die. It all just feels like a convenient contrivance to be able to have environmental storytelling instead of doing something more visually interesting or mechanically fleshed out. Eventually, I just got tired of only ever reading about some of these potentially interesting events without ever getting to see or experience them for myself. In the base game, for instance, when you arrive at the inn at the crossroads, things are actively happening in the environment that set the stage for the scenario about to unfold there, with people taking shelter in their homes or fleeing the village altogether. You don't just find a note on the ground that tells you what happened there, you get to see it actively happening, which makes the world feel more alive and lived in. And that's the sort of thing that's largely missing from Blood and Wine's world design, as it feels like the vast majority of environmental storytelling is conveyed exclusively through written notes. I mean, there are some decent story premises going on in some of these notes, like a guy rigging up a series of mirrors to reflect sunlight into a valley where his lover's family resides, which is perpetually cast in shadow during the winter when the sun doesn't reach as high in the sky. It would have been cool for that to be an actual quest where you get to talk to the guy, help him set up his contraptions, ward off the harpies that get attracted to the sparkling light of the mirrors, visit the valley and see how the new lighting affects the family there, maybe do some kind of witchery stuff to prevent the harpies from coming back, and so on. But instead it's just 2 short paragraphs in a note. Consequently, practically everything in the open world of Toussaint just feels like shallow and repetitive filler content to me, like CD Projekt created this beautiful world but then didn't have any good ideas for interesting content to populate it with, or else didn't have enough time to develop more interesting quests and gameplay scenarios, and thus resorted to simply copy-pasting the same basic encounters we've already seen and done hundreds of times already in the base game, without enough mechanical evolution or contextual variety to make them any less tedious or tiring than they already were in the base game. Mind you, it's 100 times easier to just drop a few enemy models into an area, paste a few generic NPC corpses in, and type up a paragraph or 2 of text and stick it on a note in one of the corpse's inventory, as compared to writing out a full storyline for some original scenario, scripting out the events, animating cutscenes, and recording dialogue. If you consider the timeline for when these expansions released, with Hearts of Stone being 5 months after Wild Hunt, and Blood and Wine being 7 months after Hearts of Stone, and then factor in that Blood and Wine is 2 or 3 times bigger than Hearts of Stone in terms of the world and the amount of content in it, while only getting an extra 2 months of dedicated development time, and that they had this relatively large map they had to fill with something to justify its size and the $20 price tag, then it would seem like a pretty reasonable hypothesis that they took the faster, simpler route with the side content and didn't put nearly as much time or effort into it as some other aspects of this expansion's design. I can tolerate some filler content here and there in these types of games, but the problem is that it feels like the literal majority of this DLC is pure filler. Almost every interactive point of interest is a simplistic and repetitive combat encounter. The majority of side quests are made in service of sending you to these shallow points of interest, and the majority of the landmass is dedicated to housing these tedious points of interest. It maybe wouldn't be so aggravating if the expansion just weren't so big in the first place. After all, I praised the side content in Hearts of Stone for being more complex and fleshed out than it was in the base game, and Blood and Wine is about the same in terms of quality here. The problem is that it just stretches the quality out too much with too much repetition of the same basic things over and over again. In Hearts of Stone, the points of interest were plentiful enough to offer some satisfaction in the exploration and environmental storytelling, but weren't so excessive as to wear out their welcome like they do for me in Blood and Wine. I wasn't a huge fan of CD Projekt's execution of the open world gameplay design in the base game to begin with, and so I was relieved when Hearts of Stone showed some restraint and did something different by being smaller and more focused, only to find myself exasperated with them doubling down on things I didn't like in the base game with this second expansion. It all gets to be a little overwhelming and messes with the game's pacing, too, with various quests sending you out to explore new areas of the map where you're constantly bumping into new quests and points of interest that pull or push you into yet other directions and make it difficult to focus on what you want. While doing the quest to unlock the new Witcher mutations, something I wanted to accomplish early so I could have more time to experience the new abilities, I wound up getting into a freestyle rap battle in the streets of Beauclair, stumbling into a quest to investigate noises occurring at the cemetery at night, doing a sub-quest for someone in the cemetery as part of that quest, going out of my way to claim my reward for that sub-quest, and going on a treasure hunt also initiated in the cemetery, both of which sent me out to explore other regions around Beauclair and then return to the cemetery. I also turned down a quest to help a curator recover some stolen art, went investigating a sunken shipwreck and underwater ruins along the path to my objective, which both wound up being part of some quest or treasure hunt I hadn't yet picked up, and cleared out a monster nest hoping it would give me a key to one of those locked chests I had to pass up. What should have been a 30-minute quest ended up taking me over 2 hours to accomplish because of all the constant distractions, none of which proved to be all that fun or worthwhile, except for maybe the initial quest to stop the nightly disturbances in the cemetery. Some people may hear that description of me getting so easily sidetracked by optional content and claim that to be a positive element in the game's favor, using that as evidence of, look how much content there is in this expansion, there's things to do everywhere you look. But it messed with the narrative pacing of some of these quests by having all these random interruptions, and it gave me a lot of cognitive dissonance between trying to accommodate everything popping up and demanding my attention while also wanting to focus my attention on one thing at a time. After finishing the first leg of the main quest, which is basically just to arrive and meet all of the key NPCs while establishing the main premise of the main quest, I was already overloaded with side quests that I'd picked up from just 2 notice boards along the path of the main quest line. It was a cumbersome chore just to figure out where to start clearing out my journal since I had all these things to do and no real context for anything going on with any of them, since they were all notice board quests given to me by people I didn't yet know with no reason to care about doing them other than the fact that it's content that I paid for as part of the DLC expansion and that I should seek them out if I wanted to get my money's worth. Even the side quests fall victim to the shallow content padding. There are 65 officially listed side quests, and of these, 7 are so important as to be practically main quests that I can't really count them as side quests, since they're the ones that introduce critical new gameplay mechanics, like your player home, the new mutations, Grandmaster Witcher armor, and so on, or else occur during or as a result of the main quest, like the Warble of a Smitten Knight with Guillaume and Vivienne, which is set up multiple times throughout the main quest before spinning off into its own optional side quests. So that leaves us with 58 that I would actually consider to be true side quests, and of these, 3 are so short and pointless that they solve themselves literally seconds after you pick them up. One of which is basically just a reminder to go talk to someone and not really an actual quest. 4 are pretty standard, albeit slightly different variations of things we've already seen and done before, like fist-fighting tournaments and Gwent tournaments, and 37, accounting for 63% of the remaining 58 side quests, almost a 2/3 majority, are just excuses to send you to various points of interest, the likes of which I already described previously as being simple, shallow, and repetitive combat encounters with no real story, characterization, or unique gameplay scenario. The bulk of these pertain to the Knight for Hire quest markers, in which you're sent to perform 15 knightly deeds in service of the Duchy by clearing out monster dens and bandit camps and abandoned sites and whatnot, or else are vintner's contracts, which send you into a wine cellar right next to the quest giver to simply clear it of all monsters, or are starting points for treasure hunts where you read a note, follow a trail, and then open a treasure chest, of which there are 20, or pertain to the Wine Wars quests, which send you out to 15 more points of interest to fight enemies in what is possibly the worst bit of content padding in all of The Witcher 3. The Wine Wars quest is particularly egregious because it seems like it's going to be an interesting quest line. It establishes two feuding vintners vying for the right to purchase the Belgard vineyard to expand their own business. Each of them secretly tasks you with cleaning up a bunch of problems in their own vineyard, and you soon realize, through yet more notes found on dead corpses, that there seems to be a third party playing them against one another and framing the other for each vintner's problems. However, the ultimate goal of the quest boils down to go to 5 locations and kill everything there for the Coronata vineyard, then go to 5 locations and kill everything there for the Vermentino vineyard, and then go to a couple locations and kill everything there to find out who's behind the problems, where seemingly every objective expects you to fight Archospores over and over and over again. Then, once you finish that, it springs up a bonus stage to go to 5 more locations to fight even more monsters. I was already pretty bored and mildly annoyed with the first 2 stages of the Wine Wars quest, but then once it threw the 3rd stage at me, I became actively irritated by the mindless repetition and wanted to quit the whole quest line altogether. In between all of these objective markers for the Wine Wars quest are countless more unrelated points of interest that consist of essentially the exact same scenario just copy-pasted into a new location with a different note found on the scene, and they're all clustered close together along your quest path, so you may as well do them while you're already in the area doing those sorts of things, so the repetition gets to be even more extreme than just what the quest entails by itself. With those 44 side quests out of the way, that leaves us with only 14, or roughly 25% of the total side quests on offer, that actually involve some sort of developed storyline, multi-stage progression, interesting character, or unique scenarios. To be fair, 14 developed side quests is a lot more than we got in Hearts of Stone, so I can't really complain, but these quests are in such a minority of what all else is on offer in this DLC that they simply get drowned out by all the obnoxious filler, and yet even these are hit or miss for me. The only 3 that I really liked were Big Game Hunter, in which you basically go on a safari to help a traveling photographer capture magical images of local wildlife, who turns out to have a compelling motivation for why he seeks these exotic photos. Portrait of a Witcher as an Old Man, in which you model yourself for a painter and have to seek out the right location and pose for the best result. And Equine Phantoms, in which you take a hallucinogenic drug and team up with Roach to solve the mystery of a wraith taking the form of a horse haunting a woman.
Hey, know how you always show up when I whistle? How's that work exactly?
Well, you're my human. Gotta be there when you need me. Yes, I'll be there for you, ooh, as the world falls down. As the world falls down.
All of which are fun and different types of scenarios than we've seen previously throughout the series, with a bit of a nod to other quests like Goodness Gracious Great Balls of Granite, in which you have to retrieve a pair of magical testicles that have been stolen off a famous statue, Extreme Cosplay, in which elven statues come to life and attack a club reenacting ancient elven stories, and Paper Chase, in which you deal with the excessively convoluted bureaucracy of filling out paperwork for a bank.
Sign this for me, will you?
Oh, there you are. Listen, there's something
We're on break. Ah, you try to be polite, it just never gets through.
You must wait. They have the break now.
Which I didn't necessarily like, but thought were at least unique and memorable. Other side quests seemed like they would be interesting, but ended up subtly disappointing me. A Knight's Tale is all about folklore curses and supposedly evil witches meddling with human affairs, wherein a woman waiting for her lover to return gets turned into a tree that bleeds when struck with an axe, which is exactly the sort of thing I like in my Witcher quests. But this quest spoils its own solution by giving you a book that explicitly tells you what not to do in meeting with the witch, and pops a cave entrance marker on the mini-map to indicate that there's a hidden cave worth exploring right under the witch's hut before you've even had line of sight to notice the cave for yourself. And if you do like I did and read the book but then reload your save because you were confused by the presence of a docile panther and wanted to use Axii on it to make sure it stayed calm as you walked past it instead of it suddenly ambushing you out of the blue, which ironically wound up doing the exact opposite of what Axii is supposed to do and actually aggroed the panther by initiating combat mode with it, with Geralt only acknowledging the fact that the panther was docile after it had already been aggroed, and didn't think to read the book again after reloading, then you run into an awkward situation where the quest just kind of breaks down and you don't get the correct dialogue option to humble yourself before the witch and have to tell her, never mind, I'll lift the curse myself, but then Geralt still tells the quest giver he had to bow and scrape to get her cooperation, which never actually happened. I also accidentally interacted with the main thing in her hut that I was supposed to interact with first, which triggered a cutscene and meant I missed out on all the other background details in her hut because I didn't psychically know to save the bearskin on the wall for last. So this should have been a quest right up my alley, but the whole thing just kind of unraveled with a bunch of small threads being pulled out of position all at once, and it ended up being pretty underwhelming for me. Another quest, There Can Be Only One, is all about checking your alignment with the 5 chivalric virtues as a test to earn Erendite, the legendary silver sword given to you by the Lady of the Lake in the first game and which you subsequently lose at the start of the second game. This isn't really a specific individual quest, as it's more of an umbrella quest that tracks progress based on how you act during the expansion's other quests, but it's also a major part of Toussaint's virtuous culture and atmosphere. From the very beginning of the expansion, you're exposed to all different aspects of the chivalric virtues, with the 2 knights arriving in Velen trying to show valor and honor in defending the settlement from bandits, to which Geralt is able to cynically comment that their foreign notion of virtue would be in vain here, and then all of the books you can read in the first location in Toussaint tell stories about knights being heroes and promoting a life of virtue as champions of their cause, or how becoming too arrogant and prideful in one's own virtue led to the downfall of one knight who turned into a monster as punishment for tarnishing the true intent of the virtues. You can also hear people protesting in the streets about how the Beast of Toussaint has come to punish them for straying from the virtues, and then discover that is, indeed, what's seemingly going on in the main quest line. So this isn't just some tacked-on side quest, it's woven into the very fabric of the expansion's story, themes, and gameplay, and therefore should be of extreme importance.
Master Witcher, is it true virtue always trumps villainy?
Not always. Could go either way. Sometimes virtue wins, sometimes villainy gets the upper hand. Still worth being good.
But why? If it doesn't mean you'll win.
Palmer story. Think back. A decent man attracts other good folk, makes friends he can count on. A rogue? Well, he can only count on other rogues. And who would you rather have for a friend?
A man of virtue?
I must agree.
The idea is that you're meant to prove yourself worthy of wielding Erendite by demonstrating yourself to be valorous, honorable, compassionate, generous, and wise, which is determined by how you act during the various side quests, main quests, and scripted interactions throughout the entire expansion. There are multiple opportunities to prove yourself in each of the 5 virtues, so there was great thought put into how the virtues would factor into just about every quest. I loved the idea of this quest when I first picked it up, because even though the quest structure is ultimately guiding you towards picking certain options in order to fulfill this particular quest, with sort of a metagaming element in picking the right options to get the best reward, the quests usually have multiple outcomes or ways to resolve them based on these role-playing options, so it adds an extra layer of choices and consequences to the gameplay that might not have been there otherwise. However, the whole point of being virtuous is completely undermined by the fact that the quest considers your virtues to be 100% conclusively proven the moment you perform any one single act in that alignment. How in the world does it make sense, for example, for me to have proven my generosity by tipping a delivery boy a meager 5 crowns mere moments after I finished stealing thousands of crowns worth of valuables from people's homes? And then once you've checked the box for a certain virtue, you have no further reason to continue role-playing that way, as you can never lose progress towards proving your virtue. So you can be a heartless monster selfishly looking out for your own interests the entire DLC, help someone one time, and go right back to being a heartless monster, and the game will forever consider you compassionate because you did one good deed. As with the mutation system and upgrading Corvo Bianco, it's something that resolves itself really quickly and then has no further bearing on the expansion, when it seems like something that really should have been fleshed out and expanded more throughout the experience. Like, how about instead of only having to demonstrate a virtue once, you had to do it a minimum of 3 times for it to count? Or how about after having had a certain number of opportunities to prove a virtue, you had to have done so the majority of the time, so that your embodiment of the 5 virtues was a reflection of how you roleplayed the entire DLC instead of something you chose in one random specific moment. I was really let down by this quest because it felt set up to be this grand, overarching endeavor that would permeate the entirety of the expansion, but then it ended up being just a really simplistic set of binary conditions where you're either virtuous or not, with no real depth or complexity towards proving those virtues. I mean, the whole thing seems directly inspired by Ultima 4, Quest of the Avatar, in which your objective is not to defeat some bad guy, but to simply become the embodiment of the 8 virtues, so that you might be a shining example to guide the nation into a new age of enlightenment. That's exactly what CD Projekt was doing with this quest, except it's 5 virtues instead of 8, and it's a side quest instead of the main quest, but I was really hoping for something that would function as a more modern take on that classic premise. Instead, it comes off like a hollow, approximate reference as opposed to fully implementing the gameplay mechanics and overarching themes of Ultima 4's main questline, and simply left me wanting more. Ultimately, these bits of side content, from the open world exploration to the points of interest and the various side quests, are all optional and you have the freedom to ignore them if they don't interest you. But as with the base game, you kind of have to explore every option that you encounter, because you never know what quests or points of interest are going to be fun and worthwhile, or boring and pointless until completing them. Which means wading through a lot of tedious filler and lesser, potentially unsatisfying content to find the good stuff.
Magnificent, breathtaking.
The main storyline has its ups and downs too, and doesn't feel as consistently engaging or compelling as Hearts of Stone. Hearts of Stone took a little while to get its main story rolling, but once it did, it was firing on all cylinders and made the slow start and preceding build-up absolutely worth it. Blood and Wine, in contrast, follows the opposite pattern, where it gets off to a strong and exciting start and then stumbles in the second act before getting back up and having to awkwardly rush to wrap things up in the third and final act. As a general overview, the main plot structure for this DLC consists of Act 1, in which you're introduced to the new region and all or most of the major characters and begin investigating the deaths before learning the identity of the Beast of Beauclair, which then leads into Act 2, where you have to investigate the Beast's motives and figure out who might be secretly pulling their strings, which then culminates in Act 3, when there's a massive threat about to befall Beauclair and you have to find a way to stop it by resolving the central conflict that instigated the Beast's killing spree in the first place. At the end, you can choose 2 different major paths in the story that will ultimately lead to 3 possible endings, with a short epilogue to follow. To me, Blood and Wine is at its strongest in the first act, and basically just goes downhill from there, with only a few enjoyable standout moments and characters in the second half of the story. I enjoyed the early stages of exploring Toussaint and witnessing how much its culture differed from that of Velen, Novigrad, and Skellige, and there's some decently intriguing mystery going on with investigating the previous victims and trying to find out what or who is responsible for the deaths. The introductory quests have a lot of grand spectacle to them too, with fighting the giant at the windmill, seeing the Knights tournament in action and jumping in to save Guillaume again, and then rushing with the Duchess Anna Henrietta to hopefully save the next victim after you deduce who that might be by completing the Hare Hunt Festival scavenger hunt, which is itself pretty fun and amusing even if it's relatively short.
When a soul of good or ill repute brings me a gift, fitting tribute. Why, you bomb-botched wretch!
He's ruined the game!
Disgraceful!
That moment when Henrietta rips the outer shell of her dress off and you race up towards the palace gardens on horseback is genuinely exciting because there's a palpable feeling of tension, with potential stakes on the line if you're not fast enough, in addition to the anticipation of wondering what will happen next since you don't yet know what to expect from the Beast of Toussaint should you actually encounter it. I especially enjoyed watching her try to maintain appearances and her regal image in public at the tournament, but then not being afraid to break tradition and get her hands dirty, jumping into action when push comes to shove. That sets her up as a fun and likable character, as compared to De La Tour, who's established as a generic stock character from the beginning and never really grows out of that role. De La Tour is the duchy's captain of the guard, essentially Henrietta's right-hand man who plays a prominent, recurring role throughout the story, but he's your stereotypically stubborn and hard-headed commander-type character who, for some reason, is overconfident in him and his troops' abilities to solve the current problem, despite being so in over their heads that they had to summon an expert to handle the situation, who's then overly dismissive and confrontational towards the expert's expertise. The whole time he's spouting cliches about, bah, my men can handle it, and why'd we need this outsider, and so on, and I was like, okay dude, I get it, you're a stock character, you can stop now. And then, just as you'd expect, he goes through the typical arc of begrudgingly coming to accept Geralt's capabilities once you've proven yourself, at which point he falls back into being more of a plot device, someone to advance the story by doing things off screen as opposed to feeling like an actual character. Probably the best new character introduced in Blood and Wine is Regis, a vampire friend from Geralt's previous adventures in the books. He comes off really endearing here and somehow manages to feel like one of the most true and genuine friends Geralt has ever had throughout this series, which is made all the more impressive given the fact that we've never seen him before in any of the previous games. I mean, even though we only get a few hours of interaction with him over the course of this one DLC expansion, his connection with Geralt feels even deeper than Zoltan or Dandelion, who have been there through thick and thin from the very first game.
In any case, this vampire's name was Regis. Zoltan can back me up.
He was your friend and could pull red-hot horseshoes from the hearth without burning his bare hands.
What happened to this Regis?
Emil Regis Rohalak Tertsif Godfroy died fighting by your side, Geralt. Let's drink to him and others who have fallen.
Both of those characters have had their moments of casual heart-to-hearts with Geralt throughout the series, but it's an extremely personal and congenial experience just sitting down with Regis in the cemetery, drinking a bottle of alcohol and talking about the past, what happens when they die, what secrets they might have, and whether or not Geralt would choose a different life for himself than that of a Witcher if given the option, and then getting to repeat the process after the main story concludes while reflecting on everything that's just happened and what lies in store for the characters' respective futures. Conversations with Regis get into deep, philosophical topics with some regularity, and it's these calm moments when you can just settle down and engage with the characters that Blood and Wine is truly at its best. I especially appreciate Regis's loyalty to Geralt. At numerous times throughout the main quest, he encourages you to do things that he believes to be the best option, but if you say, no, I'm doing things my way, he doesn't get upset or protest, he just acknowledges your decision and agrees to help. They didn't try to force some kind of conflict or tension between the characters for the sake of drama, and I think that's part of the reason he feels like such a good friend, because he and Geralt are able to see eye to eye about things and respect each other enough to go along with whatever their friend is planning, even if it's not necessarily in their own best interests. And it's not just a one-way street either, as you, the player, are given the opportunity to go along with Regis's plans if you so desire. His actual introduction is a little awkward if you haven't read the books, however, because it happens during an action scene where there's really no time to catch up and properly establish who this character is. So you have an entire conversation with him where he and Geralt act real friendly and shocked to see each other again, and Geralt's apologizing profusely for something that happened in the past with no explanation in the moment of what exactly he's apologizing for, and no opportunity to read the character entry to have a better idea of who this character is until after the conversation is over. After a minimal amount of catching up, they then go right into talking about the main story, and then he has to leave suddenly, so it's like they rushed right past the exposition to move on to other topics before promptly ending the scene. Once you get past that somewhat awkward introduction and get to chat with him in proper at the cemetery a little later, he starts to settle in and you can get a good feel for him as a character. But that first meeting was a prime instance of me being thrown completely out of the experience by virtue of having not read the books to have the vaguest inkling of an idea of what's going on. Except for those early and generally minor issues I had with De La Torre's character and Regis's introduction, I enjoyed the early stages of the main quest and thought Act 1 was setting itself up pretty well to be an intriguing mystery, with mysterious people spying on you from a distance and picking up weird clues like a severed hand that's seemingly still alive. But then it spoils the entire mystery almost as soon as it begins by having you catch the Beast of Toussaint in the act and thus learning its true identity, at which point it gets away and the pacing of the story slows down while you try to investigate its backstory and motivations. That could have been an interesting and engaging plot arc to follow if the Beast were made to be a deep and complex, possibly sympathetic character, but unfortunately they don't do a whole lot with the villain's actual character, as the second act is essentially just a series of wild goose chases and pointless red herrings until things conveniently start clicking into place, which then results in a sudden twist that some previously unheard of and unestablished person of great importance to the duchy was secretly behind the Beast's killings all along, but this comes out of nowhere for almost no reason. And then there's barely any time spent exploring this new character's motivation as everything starts hitting the fan all at once, thus forcing you to rush forward to stop the threat and save the day, with none of the three endings being all that satisfying. That's about as spoiler-free as I can make my synopsis of the main questline without getting into heavy spoiler territory. So if you're trying to avoid spoilers, then skip ahead to the conclusion, because this next section where I get into the plot in greater detail is going to be full of them. This is your obligatory spoiler warning. After frantically rushing to save the latest victim, you arrive too late to help, but get to meet the Beast of Toussaint, who turns out to be a higher vampire named Detloff, who apparently has a strong blood connection to Regis as the one who gave part of his own blood to bring Regis back to life. But since Regis not only knows the villain, but knows him extremely well, that deflates a fair bit of tension right off the bat when you have a trustworthy companion telling you that it's not in the bad guy's nature to kill as he's currently doing, and that there must be some good reason for him to be committing these murders. Like I said, that could be a compelling plot hook if Detloff were properly fleshed out with meaningful character interactions and a thorough exploration of his backstory. But the DLC only gives us but a cursory, perfunctory glance over his character and motivation before moving on to other subjects, while never really making Detloff a true focal point in the story when he's supposed to be the main villain up until the true villain gets revealed. The whole point of Detloff's character is that he was, at one time, deeply in love with a human woman named Renna, who went missing one day and later turned out to have been kidnapped by someone using her as a means of extortion to get Detloff to murder certain knights of the duchy who have been hypocritical of their chivalric oaths. That, I suppose, is meant to make him somewhat sympathetic, since it portrays him as a victim while also giving him a rational reason to be committing such heinous crimes. It's not that he's inherently evil or some kind of senseless beast that needs to be put down, in other words. He's a somewhat relatable guy just caught between a rock and a hard place. He's also shown to be remorseful over having to kill a newfound friend per the extortionist's orders, and severs his own hand, the one used to kill his friend, in a frenzied act of contrition, thus adding an extra degree of guilty tragedy to his story. This dimension of his backstory is unfortunately conveyed through fairly boring and straightforward means, as we're merely told about Detloff's personality and relationship with Renna via 2 dialogue sequences with Regis, and we only get to see Detloff's remorse over killing his friend in a flashback. The flashback at least has a compelling element of visual storytelling to it, and it's ultimately preferable to reading about it in a diary entry or having Detloff flat out say, "I'm remorseful" in a dialogue sequence, but it's perhaps not as exciting as getting to see it happen during an interactive encounter with Detloff, with some kind of more pressing stakes or tension on the line, or else through a more creative means than just simply showing it in a flashback. In fact, that's about all the game does to explore his character, as from that point onward, Detloff spends almost the entire rest of the game off-screen, with Regis keeping an eye on him, while you go off searching for the real villain who's extorting Detloff. He does show up at one random moment later on at a quasi-dinner party with the Duchess and Lady Oriana, who's hosting an extravagant art exposition. This seems at first like it's going to be a relatively tense and riveting encounter. Ominous music even kicks in to set such a mood as Geralt becomes more alert and cautious at the surprise appearance of Detloff, perhaps unsure if he can trust him in the presence of Henrietta. It is, after all, an intriguing premise, the Beast of Beauclair coming to join you for dinner, while the Duchess who hired you to kill him is sitting there with you, unaware of the fact that the Beast is right there before her very eyes. This could have been a great opportunity for engaging character interaction with Detloff, with you talking in coded metaphors to clue him into what you're thinking while deciding how much you want to risk potentially revealing to the others at the table. He might do the same, leading to a more active effort on your part attempting to interpret what he's trying to tell you and you getting to learn more about him in the process. Maybe there would even be consequences for how Henrietta handles the contract if you let it slip that the beast is right here and that you're considering helping him, or maybe you could say something to upset Detloff that might cause a scene and spoil his cover. But instead of doing anything exciting or interesting like that, the dinner party lasts for literally one dialogue choice and then Geralt makes an excuse to get up and leave. And that's pretty much the last we get to see of Detloff until the climax, when he turns into a genocidal maniac and starts murdering hundreds, if not thousands of innocent people, all because it turns out the woman he loved faked her own kidnapping and was the one manipulating him into committing the murders. At that point, any sympathetic or relatable trait they were trying to establish with his character gets thrown out the window in favor of turning him from what could have been a deep and complex character into a mindless, heartless monster. Maybe that dramatic turn could have worked if it were built up sufficiently, but there just wasn't enough time spent exploring Detloff's character and getting to know him, which is problematic when his motivation for why he's committing these murders is the whole point of Geralt's investigation. Throughout the whole DLC, you only get to interact with him like 3 times before his ultimatum, hardly any of which are used to sufficiently flesh out his character. Somehow that 45-second one-prompt dialogue with him at the dinner table is the only one that attempts to express anything about his motivation or character traits, as the first meeting is just a basic standoff before a fight, where both he and Geralt are completely ignorant of who the other is and what's going on, and thus don't have anything too meaningful to say about the situation other than to call Geralt's morals into question. And the third is when he learns that his lover was the one extorting him and orchestrating the killings, at which point he stops being the emotionally impulsive but ultimately noble-hearted Detloff that the game was trying, almost in vain, to establish.
Despite appearances to the contrary, you two are quite alike. You've both noble hearts, yet you both are wont to perform ignoble deeds. When circumstances force you to, of course.
Vampires rarely help humans. Must have had his own agenda, hunting the beast.
You err. He slew it for one reason alone. The monster killed a lad who once in the street had offered Detloff an apple, expecting nothing in return.
Terribly noble of him.
You do not have a monopoly on altruism, my friend.
And becomes almost a different character altogether, more akin to a generic bad guy who wants to kill everyone and who must be stopped.
If you do not, I will raze Beauclair to the ground. This I promise you. You've 3 days.
His lover, meanwhile, is revealed in what I think is meant to be a shocking surprise twist to be Henrietta's sister, Syanna, the eldest daughter of the duchy who was outcast and disowned by the royal family due to a superstitious belief that she was a bad seed by virtue of being born during a solar eclipse. Thus, she's grown up to be bitter and resentful of the duchy and is seeking revenge. As with Detloff, this could have been an interesting concept if they'd actually bothered to do anything more substantial with her, but she doesn't get much screen time either, and the twist revelation comes out of nowhere with no establishing of her character or proper foreshadowing of this potential plot element during the actual story. Her being the secret main villain of the DLC could have been dramatic and exciting if she had been introduced earlier on, so that we could get to know her a little bit and then perhaps feel betrayed when we discover that it was secretly her all along. But by putting 2 twist reveals regarding the same character in back-to-back moments, the first being that Henrietta has a sister at all, and then almost immediately thereafter discovering that her sister is the true villain orchestrating everything, undermines both revelations as it comes off feeling like an afterthought in the story, like the writers thought her up halfway through and just awkwardly shoehorned her into it. To be fair, there's some optional foreshadowing if you're exploring and paying attention to things, as you can find an old pamphlet from a concerned citizen suggesting that Henrietta isn't the true heir to the throne as she's not the eldest daughter, and there's a family portrait in the ducal Camerlengo showing an auburn-haired daughter that's obviously Henrietta, and then a raven-haired daughter next to her, who, in a bit of artistic symbolism, is also the only one looking away in the portrait. So maybe it's not meant to be a surprise, but she's not mentioned anywhere in the main quest up until she becomes relevant to the plot, and the journal specifically calls Syanna's existence a surprise and states who knew Henrietta had a sister, which is pretty nonsensical when you consider that family portrait is right there in a public building for anyone to see, so it certainly seems like a deliberate effort to keep her existence more obfuscated until the dramatic reveal, when Henrietta starts to suspect that her sister might be among the schemers. And once again, as with Detloff, all of Syanna's exposition is given to us through relatively boring and straightforward dialogue where Henrietta simply tells us her backstory, and then that's practically all the game gives us. You meet up with her once during the moment you realize that Rena and Syanna are the same person, but there's not much actual interaction with her during the scene, and she barely says anything of significance. In fact, her words and actions only serve to confirm what we've already been told about her in the first place, as opposed to expanding on her character with new explanations, clarifications, or providing an alternative point of view, or getting into her motivations a little deeper. After that first meeting, she gets put under heavy guard off screen, and you don't get to see her again until the very end of the DLC, unless you pick a branch in the main questline to seek her out so that you can bring her to Detloff, which leads to an extra quest where you accompany Syanna to a special location from her childhood and learn more about her past and why exactly she's so hell-bent on revenge. That branch being an optional choice, however, means you might never get to learn anything deeper about her backstory or motivation, beyond what Henrietta tells you during her exposition dump if you choose the alternative to seek out the unseen elder vampire to force a meeting with Detloff, which at that point in the story could be seen as the more sensible option. The shortcomings with Detloff and Syanna are made all the more glaring by how much better the characterization was handled in Hearts of Stone, with Gaunter O'Dim and Olgierd getting significantly more screen time and direct player interaction, as they consistently appear throughout the entire DLC and are rightfully treated as the main focal point of that expansion's story. There's also a lot of great visual storytelling with the way O'Dim's character traits are portrayed through his actions and the way he carries himself, such that we get to progressively understand who he is and what he's like without the game needing to rely on exposition dumps or outright telling us things about his character. And we get some really interesting gameplay scenarios as uniquely clever ways to explore Olgierd's backstory, such as by recreating memories of him with his wife in the Painted World. With Blood and Wine, there's not only far less screen time and narrative involvement with its two main antagonists, or just characters, if you will, but the bulk of their characterization is merely told to us through dialogue sequences by other characters, and it doesn't do anything all that creative gameplay-wise with exploring their characters either. Take Detloff, for instance. You go through great lengths to brew a special potion to tap into his memories, which then leads to a straightforward black and white cutscene when that could have been used as an opportunity to do something more interesting, like letting Geralt experience Detloff's memories from his own point of view, with a player controlling Detloff and maybe getting to make personality choices and role-playing decisions about how he handles certain situations, kind of like what you do with Ciri in the base game. Syanna at least gets a wonderfully unique gameplay sequence via the Land of a Thousand Fables, in which you accompany her through a magical fairy tale world with moments along the way to talk about her childhood, so there's that at least, but it doesn't carry near as much of an emotional weight to it as getting to witness Iris and Olgierd's marriage blossom and then crumble in Hearts of Stone. Additionally, that whimsical sex scene with Syanna in the clouds feels completely forced and unearned, in stark contrast to the sex scene with Shani, which had infinitely more build-up, development, and payoff. With Shani, the sex scene was the culmination of an entire night of romantic escapades, and the whole questline was building up almost specifically to that moment. In Blood and Wine, the sex scene comes out of nowhere for no justifiable reason, really, other than CD Projekt checking the box for sex scene on their production quota because that's what people have come to expect from their games, and thus they needed to have one somewhere. It's an artistic and visually interesting scene, so it's worth it to see, I guess, but the whole thing felt narratively and contextually inappropriate to me. I mean, the plot's moving forward at a pretty brisk pace at that point in the game, but then it randomly comes to a screeching halt for a gratuitous sex scene to play out, with what feels like the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time, considering everything that was going on in the story up until that point. I didn't like Syanna much in the first place, and it felt like there should have been more important things to worry about in that situation than satisfying our carnal pleasures. And yes, I know time flows differently in the Fable sphere, but I'm talking about the pacing of the story, not the real-world application of time sensitivity. And yet, I went along with it anyway just because it seemed like a clear case of optional side content that I would have missed if I'd turned it down. It turns out there aren't any real consequences for that decision either. I think it only gets you one line of unique dialogue during your final meeting right before the DLC's ending, which doesn't affect any of the outcomes. So even though it's a novel and interesting scene, the choice wasn't satisfying to me on either a narrative storytelling level or a mechanical gameplay level. As I mentioned previously, the main questline falls into a lull in the second act, which is where you spend the bulk of your time investigating leads to figure out Detloff's motivation and eventually connecting him to Rena and Rena to Syanna. I found that whole process to be pretty boring and uneventful, however, as it felt like everything was just a bunch of wild goose chases and red herrings where nothing of any significance really gets accomplished, with a lot of characters and plot threads being introduced just to get resolved immediately thereafter, oftentimes with no further impact or consequence on the story. Your first step after meeting Detloff and reuniting with Regis is to brew a memory potion so you can learn more about Detloff, which leads you to the Boot Black, who sends you to the toy shop, where you find letters from Detloff's blackmailer, which you take to Anarietta, whose sommelier then tracks the smell of dried wine on one of the notes in the Ravello vineyard, headed by the steward Fabrizio, where you investigate the cellar for missing wine and discover that Fabrizio sold a barrel to a Centrian nobleman, whose mercenaries you then intercept to find out more about the Centrian. So then you go to the guard barracks to wait for De La Torre to figure out where to go, and he sends you to a private art exposition hosted by a woman named Oriana in search of the man from Sintra. But to find him, you first have to find the woman he came with, a performer named Cecilia, who he apparently murdered, and learn that the Centrian was there to steal a necklace but left a dagger behind as evidence, bearing the seal of the clan of Duntine. So then you go to Delacroix's windmill to plan your attack on the castle, where you apprehend its ruler, a former knight named Roderick, who says he'd brought the mercenaries in to help Sienna, where you discover that Rena and Sienna are the same person, thus concluding Act 2 and setting us up for the climax in Act 3. It's supposed to be a trail of breadcrumbs that eventually link Detloff to Sienna, but there are so many intermediary steps involved, with so many different people coming and going at a bunch of small locations that you only visit once for a few minutes at a time, that the mystery just gets bogged down in minutia and you start to lose track of the greater picture of what's ultimately going on in the story. Each new clue that you find is basically the start of an all-new trail, with no consistent through line linking everything together. Sure, one thing always leads directly to the next, but by the time you get more than one step away from any given clue, it ceases to matter in what happens further down the line, as its existence in the story is usually just a means to move you from point A to point B, and C and D and E and so on. Finding the man from Sintra is basically pointless, for instance, seeing as you never actually find him, at least not as part of the actual questline, and he ends up being completely irrelevant to the plot. You spend a couple major steps in the main questline trying to find this guy, and then his involvement in the story gets resolved completely off-screen, with the game literally throwing that whole plot arc out the window.
I knocked the weapon out of his hand and pushed him hard. He
fell out of the window.
Just so.
It feels like they wrote themselves into a corner with a man from Sintra and didn't know how to resolve his role in the story, and thus decided to write him out of it completely, making that whole plot arc feel anticlimactic and unproductive. The dagger he left behind clues you into where to go next, and the fact that he was trying to steal the heart of Toussaint indicates to Anarietta that Sienna is likely involved somehow. So it does technically lead somewhere, but that's information you discover almost by coincidence at the very end of the questline. These details weren't established earlier in the process of finding him, and they're not treated as a payoff for anything you were specifically trying to accomplish, seeing as you weren't at the art exposition to stop him from robbing Oriana, and you weren't looking for a murder weapon. These are things you just incidentally happen to find along the way, so those revelations feel sort of like they were plucked out of thin air and coincidentally dropped into the plot for the sole purpose of getting us to the next step in the story. That being the point where you discover that Rena and Sienna are the same person, and that Sienna is the one pulling Detloff's strings, which causes Detloff to give his ultimatum that he'll completely destroy all of Beauclair, killing everyone there unless Sienna meets him within 3 days. That's when things start getting interesting again, because we're finally done with all the secondary and tertiary clue chasing and can get back into dealing with the main characters and the central conflict of the story. Except the game inexplicably jumps forward 3 whole days, skipping right to the climax where Detloff is already attacking the city with an army of vampires. The previous quest, Capture the Castle, ends with Anarietta taking Sienna into custody and reprimanding you for not having apprehended the beast, and then cuts right to the start of another cutscene a few days later, at the start of the next quest, Night of the Long Fangs, where she's reprimanding you once again for having still not found Detloff. That moment was extremely jarring to me because my brain didn't process that a few days later actually meant all 3 days had passed, and so I was really confused when it seemed like Anarietta was chiding me for not doing something I wasn't even given the chance to do yet. The conversation between Geralt and Regis as they're walking up to the palace suggests they were trying to do something to find Detloff and ultimately failed, but like, why didn't we get to participate in any of this ourselves through actual gameplay? Was there a quest at some point that CD Projekt decided wasn't good enough, or didn't have enough time to finish and just cut from the game, and didn't rewrite the surrounding cutscenes to accommodate the changes? Or did they figure that, narratively, the attack on the city had to happen for the climax to work, and thus figured it would be pointless to even try to stop it? If that's the case, then why even give such a long time limit of 3 days if the game was just going to skip over it altogether? Why not have the confrontation happen right then and there, and have Detloff go into a fit of rage and immediately start assembling his army to attack the city, and then we reconvene at Beauclair where the attack is about to begin or already underway? Or how about you set the previous quest during the afternoon and have Detloff give Syanna until sundown a few hours later, so that Geralt and Regis have a more realistic lack of time to accomplish anything? Either of those would be better than simply fading to black and then cutting to 3 days later, and would still allow the story to follow its exact trajectory without altering its structure or adding any extra segments between those two scenes. All it would take is rewriting the one scene to play out a little differently and possibly changing some of the dialogue in the next scene. As it is, we know that Detloff is going to attack the city in 3 days, and we know we can prevent the attack by bringing Syanna to him, so why aren't we doing anything along those lines? I understand that Henrietta doesn't want to hand over Syanna to Detloff, and that if Detloff doesn't want to be found, we're not going to find him, and so maybe anything we try would ultimately accomplish nothing anyway. But this is a prime opportunity in the story for some kind of meaningful character building and storytelling to raise the stakes for what's about to come, to make the climax more tense and exciting. But instead of doing something, anything, to flesh out the story in a meaningful way, they did literally nothing at all. Why, for instance, is there not a quest or dialogue sequence where we get to talk to Henrietta to try to convince her to turn Syanna over to Detloff, or where we devise a plan to use Syanna as bait to lure Detloff out of hiding with the intent of killing him, or where we talk to Syanna to learn more about Detloff and why she used him? Why does Detloff have to be so intent on not coming out of hiding for anyone but Syanna? Why can't the story just allow him to receive counsel from Regis so that we can try to talk him out of the attack, or possibly side with him to infiltrate the palace and retrieve Syanna in an optional quest branch? Why aren't we at the very least doing something to prepare defenses for a possible attack on the city? Why do we wait until after the attack has already started, when hundreds of innocent people are already dying, to turn to the last resort of contacting the unseen elder vampire to force a meeting with Detloff?
It is a last resort. Absolutely.
Last resort? The hell? Why?
Shouldn't we have been considering that before the time limit ran out? There's just so many things that could have or maybe should have been happening during that 3-day time span that just got left completely out of the game, that it feels like a legitimate mistake in the production process and was almost enough to ruin the whole climax for me.
Your Grace, the population demands she be punished. Syanna's committed terrible crimes, spilt so much blood.
Another word, Palmerin, and I shall spill even more blood. Yours.
It's also the point in the story when I started losing a lot of respect for Henrietta as a character, as she rapidly devolved from a fun and likable go-get-em kind of leader who takes matters into her own hands and who seems to have a reasonable sense of intuition about her, into a spoiled, immature ignoramus making idiotic comparisons between hunting foxes with beagles and hunting a higher vampire as a way to chastise Geralt for being unable to find Detloff.
I've begun to suspect my beagles might have done a better job.
Does she not understand that a higher vampire can literally vanish into thin air, leaving no trace whatsoever, and that the degree of difficulty in tracking a vampire is exponentially more challenging than tracking a fox? And then if you try to point out these logical differences to her, she gets offended and comes just short of accusing you of treason.
Truly. Like the ones between a pathetic quip and a treasonous offense. Watch your words, Witcher.
Meanwhile, she seems to be doing nothing at all to help protect her city from an impending onslaught that they know is coming, while expecting Geralt to do all the work and blaming him for not being able to solve the problem when he's apparently the only one trying to do anything productive. What happened to the Henrietta that was proactively trying to get things done and feeling flustered during moments when she was told to stay put, and why has she been replaced with the stereotypically uptight monarch who expects everyone else to do all the dirty work and gets unreasonably mad at them for being unable to do the impossible? I get that she's stressed out and frustrated by the situation, and maybe it's meant specifically to showcase that she's a flawed character who doesn't have the proper composure to be a good leader when push comes to shove, but the change in attitude and general lack of proactivity felt almost like she was going out of character to me. During the attack on the city, you get to make a choice about how to stop Detloff, either by finding Syanna or finding the unseen elder vampire, and this is where the story branches into 2 separate gameplay scenarios leading to 3 different endings depending on which path you take and what other choices you make. That's a fun concept, and I like the idea of branching paths and quest lines like this, but I find the choice to be ruined somewhat by the fact that one path is a clearly much better option than the other, seeing as Syanna's path is the only one that offers any further insight into any of the main character's motivation or backstory, which in this case is severely needed due to an almost complete lack of characterization for Syanna up until this point, and it also has a much more developed and fleshed out gameplay scenario.
Land of 1,000 fables. Incredible. Let's see where this road takes me.
Syanna's path, Beyond Hill and Dale, offers what can only be described as a magically unique scenario in which you enter into a literal fairy tale world created through a magic spell that was meant to be a secret place to entertain Anarietta and Syanna when they were children. The Land of 1,000 Fables, as it's called, houses basically every popular fairy tale story you could imagine, but puts its own spin on those stories by having the characters going mad from an eternity trapped in the fable sphere, recreating the same stories over and over again.
The thing is, Little Red Riding Hoods popped her clogs.
What?
1,000 times they cut my gut open, filled it full of rocks and drowned me in the river. So once you stopped coming, I decided to repay the little imp for all her loving labor. Who now what's at the bottom of the well, she and the hunter, which means we can't play, and I'm under no obligation to talk to you, not about beans, nor anything else. So leave me be. Sod off.
That's an interesting concept in its own right, juxtaposing this bright and colorful world with morbidly grim outcomes of fairy tales gone wrong, so to speak, but it's equally fun to spot all the references and figure out how they applied these familiar tales to this unique situation. It also makes for a fun gameplay scenario because it recreates the core appeal of the open world gameplay formula in a small environment. Once you get past the witch and team up with Syanna, you're given free reign to traverse the Fable Sphere, completing main quest objectives in a non-linear order, exploring for hidden secrets and references, and even taking on optional side quests.
Contract from a goose. That's new.
Do you really aim to concern yourself with that?
A true witcher should never abandon poultry in distress.
The atmosphere here is wonderful too, with the vibrant colors accented by a perpetual rainbow in the sky, the exotic flora and fauna complete with giant toadstools and Volpertingers, and the quaint styling of the architecture all being so exaggerated as to feel like you're literally in another world, while the soundtrack rides a perfect balance between lighthearted whimsy and foreboding eeriness, with just a splash of magical enchantment to it. In fact, it reminds me a lot of a Danny Elfman score, who did the music for a lot of Tim Burton's movies, and thus feels like the perfect tone and atmosphere to mold the Fable Sphere after. Put all of these elements together and it creates an almost nostalgic, childlike feeling of wonder and discovery just being in this environment, while still having hints of the Witcher series' darker roots. During this quest, you finally get to learn more about Syanna's past by reading the governess's notes about Anarietta and Syanna when they were children, and by direct interaction with Syanna herself, in which she tells you about how the knights mistreated her when she was exiled, how she feels about her sister and the duchy in general, and how she justifies her revenge tour to herself. As with Detloff, it turns out she's not just a murderous psychopath, but feels like she's been wronged and wants justice, thus making her a more complex character than she's initially set up to be. Besides the wonderfully unique setting, this is the reason why Syanna's path is the better choice as far as I'm concerned, because this is what finally starts to give the main story some actual depth and weight to it. Without these revelations about why these things are happening, the events of the story come off feeling meaningless and arbitrary, as it essentially boils down to Syanna is bad, wants to kill people, tricks vampire into killing people. Like a typical video game plot where it's just an excuse to force a conflict for the main character to have to fight someone at the end. It's implied to be a little deeper than that, of course, but you only get the deeper explanation that really ties everything together if you take Syanna's path, because the other path has zero involvement with Syanna or Detloff. The other path, in which you seek out the Unseen Elder, is far, far less interesting or engaging to me. I like the part where you visit Oriana and do her quest to avenge the children at the orphanage by chasing down a Garcane, only to find that she's been secretly feeding on the children the whole time, since that finally adds some depth to her character, and it's neat to see how that moment ties together with the opening title screen and the Night to Remember trailer.
Wolves asleep amidst the trees, bats all a-swaying in the breeze. But one so light just wide awake, fearing all manner of ghouls, hags, and wraiths.
Nice tune. Been a while since I heard it last.
But this quest is not exclusive to taking the Unseen Elder path, since it's only required to unlock that path, meaning you can do Oriana's quest and then still take Syanna's path for Beyond Hill and Dale, which I would say is objectively the best route to take because it grants you the most total content to experience in the main quest line, while also leaving all 3 endings open to you. Choosing the Unseen Elder path, in contrast, immediately locks you into what is considered to be the bad ending and offers far less total content to experience, while also causing you to miss out on all the meaningful backstory for the central conflict of the main plot. The actual Unseen Elder quest, What Lies Unseen, in which you visit an ancient higher vampire's lair, who's basically the godfather to all other vampires in the region and the only person who can forcibly summon Detloff to a meeting, has some interesting things going on, what with the creepy, almost primordial bioluminescent environments, the weird way that gravity seems to invert itself in certain places, and Geralt's getting ambushed by the Elder and losing a bunch of critical equipment, but it doesn't do a whole lot with these concepts and basically wastes them. Being trapped at the bottom of a deep chasm while near death with no swords or healing potions seems like a frightening and challenging situation to overcome, but you're only bereft of your supplies for a few seconds as they're all just lying around nearby, with no obstacles or impediments to make the situation actually challenging or stressful, or to provide a unique type of gameplay scenario where you have to do things differently than you normally would without your usual equipment. So having that near-death experience is functionally pointless because you're immediately back to full capacity and never really get to feel like you're wounded and vulnerable. As for the visuals, half the time it feels like you're in just an ordinary cave, the likes of which we've seen countless dozens of times already, and the inverted gravity doesn't serve much of a mechanical gameplay purpose either, since you don't actively use the gravity effects to solve puzzles or traverse the environments yourself. It functions like a lot of typical Witcher 3 style gameplay where you follow quest markers to a hotspot and press the action button to watch a cutscene. Instead of feeling like a more elaborate puzzle that I had to figure out through my own wits and observation skills, like a shorter and more simplified version of the Stone Tower in The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, it felt more like walking through a doorway to access a new room so I could watch the next cutscene. Granted, you use Ard on the stalactite in the inverted section to create a climbing surface on the normal floor, but again, that's not a creative, deductive process as you're guided specifically to that point with glowing foot trails, quest markers, and Geralt's inner monologue telling you what to do at every step of the way. So the inverted gravity works as an interesting concept for the sake of narrative presentation, but not in terms of mechanical gameplay functionality. All the while, there's not much to really see or do on this path, as it's just a couple treasure chests and journal entries along a mostly linear path with a few vampire enemies, bookended by cutscene interactions with the Unseen Elder, which don't tie in with the main story as closely as interacting with Syanna in her questline. You get some more lore and world building with things like the conjunction of the spheres and vampire customs, plus some extra interaction with Regis, which, while intriguing, isn't relevant to the central focus of the story, the relationships and conflicts between Detloff, Syanna, and Anarietta. The whole quest is relatively short too. It only lasted me 35 minutes from the branching point where you either commit to going after Syanna or the Unseen Elder to the point when the two paths reconverge with meeting Detloff. For comparison, I spent over 2 hours doing Syanna's path, which followed the exact same branching points in the main questline. So between the short length, straightforward gameplay sequences, and the lack of any direct relevance to the main plot or backstory, it just felt like this path got the short end of the stick and wasn't anywhere near as satisfying to me, almost to the point that I wonder why it's in the game at all. It seems abundantly clear to me that Syanna's path was meant to be the main focus, while the Unseen Elder path was something they quickly threw together to check off another box on the production quota for branching main questline. The fact that Regis repeatedly insists on not seeking out the Unseen Elder and instead going after Sienna could very well be CD Projekt just straight up telling the player, hey, this is the path we want you to take because it's the one that's more relevant to the story and is the one we put more effort into creating.
You can try to stand in my way. Then I shall kill you both. Though that is not at all my will. The decision is yours.
After completing either path, you then meet up with Detloff, where you're given the opportunity to either fight him or let him go, unless you took the Unseen Elder path or if you got the ribbon in the Fable Sphere, in which case you have to fight him.
Let us be done with this.
The fight with Detloff ends up being the final boss fight of the DLC, and I think it might actually be the best boss fight in the entire game, including both of the base game and Hearts of Stone. The whole fight spans 3 distinct phases where Detloff has completely different attack animations and patterns, each of which requires a different strategy to handle. In the first phase, for instance, he has a perfect block rate for attacking him head on, and so to actually damage him requires carefully timed dodges where he's attacking so that you can catch him exposed while he's still recovering from his own attack animations. The second phase adds ranged attacks and crazy blood magic abilities where he appears and disappears throughout the arena, adding extra difficulty to the task of keeping track of him and knowing when and where to move to avoid hits, which is further complicated by one of his aerial attacks having a subtle feint that might catch you off guard if you dodge on the first tell before he actually launches into his charge attack. Then in the third phase, you have to destroy things in the environment while avoiding Detloff's bloody apparition. Each phase feels distinct and introduces all new complications to the pattern, while Detloff's varied types of attacks demand a higher degree of skill to avoid than similar boss encounters throughout the rest of the game. It is, I think, possibly the most challenging fight in the entire game, and all the crazy, bloody, fleshy imagery going on in the third phase makes it a suitably climactic final battle to conclude the DLC.
Geralt of Rivia, Slayer of the Beast of Beauclair, step forth.
All of which leads you to one of 3 different endings depending on whether you chose to go after Sienna or the Unseen Elder, whether you obtained Sienna's ribbon in the Fable Sphere or not, whether you chose to fight Detloff or not, and whether or not you convinced Sienna to make amends with Anarietta, which is dependent on you having read the governess's journal and picking the right dialogue options to hear Sienna's side of the story. So there's a fair amount of narrative role-playing decisions to make in the main quest line, which end up being pretty impactful, and it's impressive that these decisions manage to work together in so many different combinations, sometimes leading you to the same ending while taking different paths there, or else leading to different endings while taking similar paths. The outcomes, therefore, feel complex and interesting because there are several variables contributing to your ending, and so it's harder to decipher where you went wrong if you wind up with a bad ending. It's not just a single choice at an obvious critical branch that ultimately makes a choice feel overly straightforward and reductive. That is, as long as you don't pick the Unseen Elder path, which permanently locks you into the bad ending straight away at the first critical decision point in the main quest line, robbing you of any subsequent choices to influence your ending. So the mechanics for how you get to the 3 different endings are fairly sophisticated, but further emphasize the Unseen Elder path as being the weaker branch in the main quest. The good ending sees Anarietta and Sienna making amends and living happily ever after, but it all feels a little too happy and contrived to sit right with me, like everyone just suddenly agrees to drop any hard feelings for everything that's transpired in favor of simply hugging it out, especially since it seems to imply that Sienna gets off scot-free after being directly responsible for 4 murders and indirectly responsible for hundreds or thousands more. Even though the game makes a point of showcasing that Sienna was genuinely wronged and that the knights she had Detloff kill aren't completely innocent, that's still no excuse for murder, and there should be consequences for those actions, misguided as they were. It's right for them to forgive each other for what happened when they were kids, but it's not right to pretend like that somehow makes up for all the other crimes Sienna committed in the meantime. I mean, Anarietta sentenced the winemaker for high treason over selling a barrel of ducal wine, a victimless crime, but then when her sister is orchestrating the murder of several knights of the duchy and is literally conspiring to kill the Duchess, the utmost form of high treason short of actually killing her, she says, "Oh, it's okay, you're my sister and I love you, I'm sorry, and all is fine in the world." I'm sorry, but I don't buy it. That's either a huge flaw in her character showcasing her inability to separate her emotions from rational thought, or else it's contrived writing to force a happily ever after on a story that doesn't really deserve one. Remember that throughout the entire DLC, it's constantly reinforcing the concept of Toussaint's 5 chivalric virtues, and yet the 2 big events in the main story, the start of Dettlaff's killing spree and his eventual attack on the city, both come about as a direct result of the 2 main characters lacking in critical virtues. Syanna demonstrates a lack of honor by lying to Dettlaff and using him to commit heinous crimes, and Henrietta demonstrates a lack of wisdom by refusing to put her sister to justice to spare the lives of thousands of innocents while also making no effort to seek out a diplomatic solution to the conflict.
If it's war this Dettlaff wants, it's war he shall have. If it's war this Dettlaff wants, it's war he shall have.
They're both equally at fault as far as I'm concerned, seeing as everything could have been avoided and so many lives could have been spared if the 2 central characters in the story had just been better people. Hence why I don't feel like the story deserves a happy ending, and why I ultimately like the bad ending where everyone dies better.
I shall never forgive you.
I wouldn't say either one deserves to die, but there absolutely should be some sort of fallout for their bad decision making and flawed character elements, and given how much the expansion stresses the concept of being virtuous, it just makes the most sense to me that this story have a tragic ending. I also like how that ending shows Beauclair in a completely different light, literally, with the extreme bloom and saturation replaced by dull, flat lighting and gray, misty skies, since that offers a dynamic contrast to how it looked throughout the entire game and works as a symbolic visual that dark times have fallen on Toussaint, which has literally lost its luster now that their Duchess is gone.
In forgiving you, I grieve. For now we must part. A shame.
Syanna.
The medium ending, or whatever you want to call it, where Syanna dies and Henrietta lives, probably gives you the most total content to experience, with a small gameplay scenario in which you find yourself imprisoned for disappointing Henrietta, It also has a fun surprise appearance by Dandelion, but it's not a very satisfying ending to me either, because no one really gets proper justice for their actions. Syanna dies before Henrietta can have any sort of reconciliation with her or learn about her true intentions, so the true villain is never really revealed in this ending, and Geralt takes the fall for Syanna's death even though he was the one solely responsible for stopping the attack on the city and saving countless other lives. Basically, this ending does nothing to redeem Henrietta in my eyes, as she carries on acting in the same sort of irrational manner that caused me to start losing respect for her in the third act, and she doesn't seem to learn anything from the experience or grow as a character, as she remains in denial of everything that Geralt did to try to help her, and also of the sinister things Syanna was getting up to behind her back. I do appreciate that all of these endings offer a pleasantly calm resolution to the story, however, as that's one thing I praised about the base game that Hearts of Stone didn't do. As much as I love Hearts of Stone, neither of its endings had much of an epilogue to let you sit back and catch your breath as the story winds down. Maybe that story didn't need any of that, but Blood and Wine being longer and much more epic in scope benefits from more falling action and denouement to bring everything to a resolution. The scene at the palace, for instance, serves multiple functions in showing some of the aftermath following the attack on the city and how the duchy is working with the local population to try to fix the damage caused by it, while also resolving the terms of Geralt's contract and commemorating his triumph with an awards ceremony, and also giving Henrietta and Syanna a final heart-to-heart to air their grievances and possibly make up to one another. If Syanna lived, then you can have a final chat with her before the palace scene to learn yet more about her motives and possibly try to convince her to make amends with her sister. If you got the bad ending where Henrietta dies and you get to witness people's reactions in the streets to her death and visit her grave. And the medium ending shows the consequences Geralt has to suffer for failing to keep Syanna safe from Detloff. Besides all of that, you can also investigate the identity of Syanna's potential 5th victim to learn she was also planning to kill Henrietta, have a friendly farewell chat with Regis in the cemetery, and settle down with your chosen partner at Corvo Bianco.
Said you wanted to run away with me to the world's end. This vineyard. Good enough?
As I said earlier, it's these calmer moments in the main quest line where you simply get to take in the atmosphere and talk to people that I find most engaging. There's a certain je ne sais quoi about sitting down with an old friend after a grand adventure, reflecting on everything that's just happened and talking about what lies in store for each other in their next adventures, which I find serenely charming. So it's nice for this DLC to end on an extended epilogue sequence that ties up all the loose ends and puts all the finishing touches on the story. I especially like the moment when you and Regis decide to go harvesting mandrake roots, as it shows a clear contrast in the characters' priorities now that the threat has been resolved, that they no longer have to worry about stopping Detloff or saving Toussaint, and that life has now returned to a simpler time where they can take a calm, peaceful moment to simply gather ingredients for a new batch of alcohol. It establishes to the audience we're at the end of the adventure now, and gives you the opportunity to feel the adventure winding down through actual gameplay by bringing the high stakes intensity of the main story back down to a more grounded starting point. It's a proper use of falling action in the literary sense that most other games don't bother to implement. And then of course Regis disappears and you have to go looking for him, which leads to a surprise attack by lesser vampires as punishment for Regis killing Detloff.
You raise your hand against a vampire! You shall die for that! I did what I had to do!
Thus showing that there are still lingering consequences for the main story, and once again making it happen organically through ordinary gameplay. This sequence is also the point where it becomes painfully obvious that this was meant to be Geralt's final send-off, a farewell letter from the developers to the audience, when Regis suggests that, after all they've been through, they deserve a bit of rest. To which Geralt agrees and then looks right into the camera in what might be the most awkward violation of the fourth wall I've ever experienced in a video game. I'm sure it's supposed to be endearing, and I would guess a fair number of people got emotionally choked up over that moment, but I was weirdly repulsed by having my character making forced sentimental eye contact with me. It made me supremely uncomfortable and left me with an unpleasant feeling as the credits started to roll. If I were in charge of directing this scene, I would have had him say, "Yeah, we do," then take a swig of booze followed by a heavy sigh as he adopts a more comfortable posture, and then have him look to the horizon somewhere off camera as the music swells into a tranquil reprise of the main theme, then cut to a wide-angle reverse shot of Toussaint with the end title screen and a heartfelt "thanks for playing" sort of message from CDPR, with Geralt repeating,
"That we do," as
the developer message appears on screen. That way it can still break the fourth wall with an endearing send-off message to the player without getting all corny and schmaltzy, and leaves the second "we sure do" alongside the message acknowledging the player, open to interpretation whether that's referring to him and Regis or him and the player, without completely destroying the immersion in the process. I've obviously been fairly critical of the main story and main questline throughout this review, but I need to point out that my criticism is largely relative and is being heavily influenced by the fact that Hearts of Stone came out first. In truth, Blood and Wine fixes a lot of problems I had with the base game's main quest, and provides a much more interesting storyline, more rich and complex characters, a more methodical pacing, a more satisfying climax, and a stronger resolution as compared to the base game. If this had been the first DLC to come out after the base game, I'd probably be singing its praises and lauding how Detloff and Syanna make for much more compelling antagonists than the Wild Hunt, and given that they have actual personality, motivation, and backstory, and we get moments of actual interaction with them, unlike Eridan, or how the middle portion where you're following the string of clues looking for Detloff's blackmailer feels like you're actually making direct progress towards achieving your goal, as opposed to the base game's meandering pacing that keeps coming up with excuses to have you doing things other than looking for Ciri, to name just a few examples. So even though I'm being super critical of it, that's not to say it's bad by any means. Some specific moments and aspects are, of course, like the lack of characterization for Sienna until the very end of the main quest line, or the 3-day time skip, or the fact that one of the branching paths feels substantially weaker than the other. But overall, I think it's objectively better storytelling than the base game, and certainly better than some other similar types of games out there. I just found Hearts of Stone to be a much better executed story, which made Blood and Wine feel like a step backwards in quality and thus somewhat disappointing in relative comparison.
I so don't feel like going anywhere. Sit here a while longer?
So we shall, my friend.
Overall, I find Blood and Wine to be something of a mixed bag. Some of its content is incredibly fun and worthwhile, and the farewell letter send-off for Geralt obviously makes it must-play material for anyone seeking a proper conclusion to the trilogy. But it feels like a noticeable step down from Hearts of Stone, which had excellent characters, stories, and engaging gameplay sequences tied together by a perfect balance in size and length for the scenarios they created. Blood and Wine, in contrast, offers a bigger, more expansive, and more epic world to explore with a lot more total content to experience, but it's also heavily diluted by a lot of repetitive and tedious filler that comes off feeling like pure content padding. It's a beautifully artistic world with a lot of intriguing environments to explore, but it's mostly in service of a bunch of simplistic and formulaic combat encounters where the bulk of marked points of interest are just excuses to have you fight something and then maybe read a note, without much in the way of interesting quests, characters, stories, challenges, rewards, or unique gameplay scenarios to discover as you explore the rest of the world outside of major locations. Some of the quests are really fun and engaging, and in fact I'd say there are more total good quests on offer than in Hearts of Stone, but despite being more numerous in total quantity, the good quests only account for a minority of quests in Blood and Wine, meaning you have to go through a lot of lesser content to get to the good stuff, and the good stuff rarely ever matched or exceeded my favorite moments from either the base game or Hearts of Stone. Lots of things that seemed like they could have been worthwhile, like the new mutation system, the player home, or certain side quests like the one where you prove your virtue to claim the legendary Silver Sword Erendite, proved underwhelming with how quickly and simply they resolved themselves when they seemed like they should have been more prolonged and involved. The main story sets up an interesting premise with fun and intriguing characters, but then doesn't do enough with its main antagonists to flesh them out properly, and takes some major stumbles in its second and third acts. It's a tough expansion to pin down because in a lot of ways it's better than the base game and thus should deserve a lot of praise, and besides that, the whole thing is just dripping with theme, charm, and atmosphere, but on the other hand, I just didn't like it as much as Hearts of Stone. Part of why I liked Hearts of Stone so much is that I wasn't very fond of CD Projekt's execution of the open world gameplay formula in the base game, and Hearts of Stone chose to de-emphasize both the size of the map and The Witcher 3's generally lackluster open world gameplay in favor of focusing more on what I consider to be the game's true strengths, its narrative storytelling elements with regards to its quests and characters. With Blood and Wine, there's still a pretty solid, focused story being told, but they also doubled down on the open world gameplay formula, and admittedly it's better this time around thanks to a more visually interesting and engaging world design and more effort given to provide narrative context for specific points of interest with notes and journal entries to read almost everywhere you look. But that's not the main appeal of these games for me, and despite the improvements, I still find Blood and Wine's open world gameplay execution less engaging and less satisfying than other similar games out there, which made getting through its 40-hour length more of a chore than I would have liked.
Not so fond of Toussaint after all, are we?
Oh, this place is like a strong wine, Geralt. Good in small sips.
Hearts of Stone felt like a deliciously sweet dessert at the end of a full-course meal, and then Blood and Wine felt like a waiter plopping another main-course entree on my plate after I'd already had my dessert. By that point, my stomach just didn't have much room left for more food, and some of the flavor was lost on me because my taste buds were still attuned to the sugary sweetness of the dessert. If this had been the first DLC, I probably would have been more receptive towards it and enjoyed it more relative to the base game. Or perhaps if I were playing these expansions as they were released and had to wait 6 months between each one, I would have had more time to grow an appetite for it and wouldn't have felt so burnt out going straight from 150 hours of the base game and Hearts of Stone into such a massive expansion where the literal majority of its content didn't interest me that much. But by playing Hearts of Stone first and absolutely loving that DLC, it made some of Blood and Wine's strengths less impressive and less impactful, and made many of its weaknesses stand out more noticeably. I think my ultimate conclusion is that if you're someone who absolutely loved the base game and who is yearning for more of The Witcher 3, then you'll probably also love Blood and Wine, because it's basically recreating the exact same gameplay formula as the base game, but with some quality improvements and new features, in an all-new environment with an all-new sense of adventure and grandiosity, with tons of all-new content to keep you busy for dozens of hours. But if you're someone who wasn't fully enamored with the base game and who was kind of on the fence about it, then you may feel that Blood and Wine repeats too many of the same mistakes that sullied the base game for you, and it may be even more exasperating now going through it all over again in such a big expansion, after already sinking so much time putting up with those issues in the base game. And if you're someone who loved Hearts of Stone because of how much it differed from the base game with its less is more approach, then you may find yourself a little disappointed with Blood and Wine taking a more is better approach. Personally, I feel like I'm some combination of the second and third verdicts.